From today's perspective, the fate of the Soviet flying giant looks logical. If this aircraft was created in our days, it would be unlikely that the developers dared to use the 404 index. In the modern world, it indicates an error. As you name the liner, so shall it fly. As you may have guessed, we will talk about the most incredible, fantastic, and ambitious project of the Tupolev Design Bureau. This plane is forever inscribed in the history of world aviation, although it never took off. So, meet the air giant, Tu-404, flying Soviet Titanic, which never took off. The project of an extra-large capacity passenger aircraft was developed at the Tupolev Design Bureau back in the early 1990s. If the Tu-404 airliner went into series production, the development of the infrastructure of the world's largest airports would have taken a different path. You'll understand why later. However, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the project was canceled. This fact still makes all aviation fans sigh. Could the Tu-404 fly at all? Let's figure it out. At the same time, we will find out how promising this project is at the present time. Initially, the Soviet superliner had two design options. The first idea of the engineers looked more traditional. In fact, it was a giant low-wing aircraft of a classic design with a two-story cabin. The sweep of the wing was 35 degrees. Externally, the plane resembled a Boeing 747, but in the Control+++ version. The engineers envisioned the salon with two floors. The lower part of the cabin accommodated 700 passengers, and the upper one, 500 people. With this arrangement, the total capacity of the aircraft reached 1,200 people. Incredible! No liner in the world is capable of transporting so many people. At the same time, the basement was built in the fuselage. It was a cargo compartment for standard cargo containers. To achieve the plan of the Soviet designers, the length of the aircraft had to be about 90 meters and the width about 77 meters, a real giant. For example, a modern airliner Airbus A380 is 73 meters long. The wingspan of the European aircraft and the Tu-404 is comparable, but the Airbus is only 25 meters high, whereas the height of the Tu-404 of the classic design was assumed to be no less than 30 meters. It's about the same height as a 9-story building. The estimated mass of the Tu-404 was about 500 tons. The liner could also take up to 130 tons of additional payload. Cargo characteristics are almost the same as those of the world's most cargo-lifting AN-225 Myra aircraft, built in a single copy in 1989. During the design process, the classic layout of the Tu-404 immediately showed its shortcomings, and the main problem was aerodynamics. To fly safely, an aircraft of this size required a lot of fuel. More fuel means less range and less payload. Consequently, the commercial feasibility of using the Tu-404 also decreased. But the Soviet Union was targeting the external market for passenger air travel, where Boeing and Airbus were leading. Besides, a bulky aircraft is less stable in flight and less controllable. Piloting such a huge aircraft is extremely difficult and risky. Therefore, the designers renounced the classic design and started developing an alternative layout scheme. This type of design is called a flying wing. Just like the American strategic bomber B-2 Spirit, whose wing is also the fuselage. This is where the fun begins. After all, civil aircraft with such a design have never existed, and do not exist to this day. And the Tu-404 was designed specifically as a civilian aircraft. No military modifications were foreseen. Why did the engineers of the Tupolev Design Bureau choose the flying wing? Now, attention! If you recall the Northrop XB-35, YB-35, a flying wing with 4 piston engines and pusher propellers, it will become clear what inspired Soviet engineers to create an alternative design for the Tu-404. The concept of a flying wing aircraft is the obsession of Jack Northrop, the great American aeronautical engineer and industrialist. The revolutionary idea is as follows. Due to the absence of the fuselage and tail assembly, the entire surface of the aircraft creates lift. Jack Northrop made his first attempt to create a flying wing back in 1939, At the end of 1941, he offered the U.S. Air Force his promising bomber of an unusual design. The U.S. had to urgently bomb Berlin, so the Pentagon took an unprecedented risk and agreed. However, the YB-35 never went into production due to numerous problems with the engines and the airframe. But the obtained developments came in handy many years later, when creating the legendary B-2 Spirit. The main advantage of the flying wing design is approximately 30% fuel savings. This is achieved due to more advanced aerodynamics. In addition, the flying wing design has a large area, so the aircraft takes off more easily and manifests itself much more steadily at the time of landing. A soft landing is extremely important in civil aviation. Due to the high air traffic at airports, passenger liners sometimes have to land in bad weather conditions. The most common problem at airports in the world is a strong crosswind. When the plane sways in the wind like a sakura branch, passengers and crew are under extreme stress. Although the pilots get their fair share of applause after landing in adverse weather conditions, it is still better to do without such adventures. The flying wing makes the plane safer. That's why the designers of the Tupolev Design Bureau seized on this idea. The result was a futuristic design that is easy to remember at first sight. The wing fuselage angle of the Tu-404 was 45 degrees. Detachable wing parts, which also served as fuel tanks, were docked to the main structure. Their sweep was 35 degrees. Soviet engineers calculated that the Tu-404 with a flying wing would need 1/3 less fuel to transport 1,200 passengers and cargo. The estimated mass of the Tu-404 airliner with a flying wing also decreased, but the biggest changes were made in the dimensions. The length of the flying wing version of the Tu-404 was only 60 meters. This is noticeably less than that of competitors and the original version of the aircraft. With the classic layout, it was 90 meters. But the width of the Tu-404 has noticeably increased to as much as 110 meters. It is the wingspan that gave this Soviet liner an outstanding and memorable appearance. The interior space of the Tu-404 is no less interesting. In the fuselage, the designers placed 6 parallel passenger sections with a capacity of 200 people each. Looks fantastic. The only noticeable drawback of this layout is the lack of passenger windows. Surely this moment would affect the desire of conservative travelers to buy tickets for this plane. However, many people would want to see it. The flying wing gave designers more engine placement options. It is worth giving more detail here. The power plant of the Tu-404 was supposed to consist of 6 turbojet engines with pushing propellers and takeoff thrust of 1,800 kgf per unit. It would seem nothing out of the ordinary. However, there is still something unusual in the design of the power plant. It's all about the propellers, which did not appear here by chance. Let us remind you that the propeller is capable of not only pulling, but also pushing. This depends on its location in relation to the rest of the aircraft structure. If it is placed in front, then it pulls. This scheme is quite common in aviation. However, due to the incoming airflow, the efficiency of the engine decreases. In modern aircraft with engines located behind the tail unit, the propeller acts as a pushing role. Due to this arrangement, the incoming flow has no effect on its blades. In addition, in this design, the air turbine drives 2 coaxial propellers with narrow crescent blades. The main feature of propellers is that they rotate in opposite directions. In doing so, the rear rotor compensates for turbulence from the front rotor and straightens the airflow. This has a positive effect on the aerodynamics, handling and cruising characteristics of the airliner. The flight range and efficiency of an aircraft with pusher propellers increases. However, along with the advantages, pusher turbojets have disadvantages. Firstly, it is the tendency of the unit to overheat. To prevent this, the designers would have to come up with additional measures. Secondly, engines with pusher propellers are more noisy, and the turbine amplifies the noise a lot. This is why pusher propeller units are mainly used on sports aircraft and drones, where small motors are used. And the needs for small aircraft, engines with pushing propellers and an electric drive are being developed, which significantly reduces noise. So by the end of the flight, all 1,200 passengers of the Tu-404 liner could simply go deaf. Provided, of course, that the plane would receive a certificate. And this is unrealistic. Otherwise, the air carrier would have to pay out legal claims. Let us recall that the noise level of modern passenger aircraft is regulated by the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO. This means that the Tu-404 would simply not be allowed to fly internationally. Russia, of course, would declare discrimination against its aircraft. Another nuance, due to which the operation of the Tu-404 is impossible, is its wingspan. 110 meters is too much. This limits the number of airports that can receive the Tu-404. Most of the runways at international airports are designed for the Boeing and Airbus standards, which have a wingspan of less than 80 meters. Even the giant Mariah air truck has a wingspan of 88.4 meters. It is strange why the Tupolev Design Bureau did not think about this in advance. But let's continue. Tu-404 is a non-standard aircraft in all respects. It requires separate ladders and possibly special fuel. This makes the aircraft inconvenient for widespread use. Economic nuances are added to the technical nuances that would hinder the operation of the Tu-404. Even before the coronavirus, it became clear that superliners weren't really needed. The situation with the Airbus A380, which we have already mentioned, proves that today there is no room for the Tu-404 on the market. In recent years, the production of Airbus 380 has decreased 3 times, and more air carriers prefer to buy more compact models. And in 2021, production of the liner was discontinued. The very idea of flight is changing before our eyes. Airspace is becoming a priority over cities, and small aviation is turning into a part of urban transport infrastructure. Transport drones, air taxis, and private quadcopters don't surprise anyone today. The segment is developing through the use of electric motors, but the future of long-range aviation is very vague. In the context of globalization, the need for superliners is somehow decreasing. Carriers prefer smaller planes for 120 to 200 passengers.